Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jyoti Vati, and I'm the head of marketing at Cropin. Today, we have a very interesting topic on hand, redefining food safety, traceability, and blockchain systems. Our world today is in need of a dynamic food chain that is safe and trusted by the end user. By keeping a record of the entire production and distribution history, suppliers and growers, through supply chain visibility and quality control systems, can implement a robust traceability system for generations to come. Traceability is increasingly becoming an important aspect of building trust between food brands and their customers. This is especially true since most products are made up of ingredients that are sourced from all over the country and often even span across countries. We have a global pantry, and no matter how strict our regulations and food safety norms are, this widespread canvas makes it difficult for regulatory bodies to monitor each and every ingredient that lands up on our plate. As a result, more companies are seeing traceability as the best way to keep a track of what's happening with their products at every point in the supply chain. Right from the manufacturers to the wholesalers and retailers, everyone is recognizing the importance of food traceability as a means to increase transparency and minimize risks. We have some very enticing thematics for the session today. As you see on your screen, we have speakers talking about the role of traceability in landscape conservation to ensure biological diversity. We also have speakers who are going to talk about their experiences in the value chains that they have worked on, like the natural rubber value chain, the coffee value chain, and the cocoa value chain. We also have a speaker from Cropin who would be talking about the seed to shelf traceability solution to ensure global food integrity. We have a stellar speaker lineup for today. As you see, we have gentlemen from WWF Technical University of Munich, Rainforest Alliance, Sukafina, and Cropin. These speakers are going to bring to you experiences and success stories from around the globe in the crop value chains that they have worked with in their organizations. Our first speaker for today is Gaurav Gupta. He is the head of conservation landscape at WWF Myanmar. Gaurav is responsible for building strategic alliances and delivering conservation outcomes in order to protect the unique biodiversity of Davna terrorism landscape in Myanmar. Welcome, Gaurav. Over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And I will start by thanking Cropin for giving us the opportunity to talk about the role of traceability in biodiversity conservation. And for the next 15 minutes, I will first start talking about, at a macro level, the impact of food systems on biodiversity loss, and then go into more details in terms of what's really the drivers, what could be the solution, and the role of technology in biological diversity conservation. So over the last 70 years, the food system have had enormous impact on biodiversity and nature in general. So for example, in the last 70 years, we have destroyed or irreversibly damaged almost 80% of our forests. And about 73% of that is driven by agriculture. And this habitat loss and ecosystem loss has been in almost every part of the world, and this is particularly profound in tropical countries. For example, Indonesia, in tropical Africa, as well as in Amazon and Latin America. And not just forest loss, the food system is the leading contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. For example, about 1/3 of the GHG emission is driven by the food systems. And this is particularly important because not just the food system is a driver, but also the food system is the sector which will be most impacted by the impact of climate change. So the relationship goes both ways. In terms of biodiversity loss as well, we have lost since we started measuring the index, the Living Planet Index, in 1970. We have lost about 70% of global biodiversity. And if we look at the drivers of biodiversity loss across different classes of vertebrates, birds, mammals, fishes, reptiles, across all these vertebrates classes, the leading biodiversity loss is food system, either habitat degradation or overexploitation in case of, for example, marine fisheries. And what's also important is to understand that in a way the food system has also been broken. Like, for example, 1/3 of the global food that's being produced, it goes to waste. And at the same time, there are 1.9 billion people in the world who are either obese or overweight, and which really contrasts with the fact that there still are 800 million people in the world who go to bed hungry every day. So in that sense, there has been, a very interesting dynamics in the food system, and there has been a really profound impact on nature that the food system has created over the last 70 years particularly. And what's really fascinating is if we look at the prices of grains over the last 70 years, and in fact, if you look at the last 500 years, the price of the grains have actually been going down. And at the same time, the GDP over the last 70 years has almost, GDP per capita has increased by 4 to 5 times. So this has been particularly interesting in the sense that this has really helped in reducing hunger, in reducing malnutrition, in reducing stunting and wasting. But at the same time, this also in some way indicate the amount of the food that is being available now and that is being produced now compared to what it was 70 years ago. So far I have talked about the food system at macro level in terms of what has been the impact of the food system on biodiversity and nature in general. So if we look at the supply chain, production, distribution, and consumption, there are many underlying drivers that are causing this impact. At the production level, the biggest driver, and particularly from the perspective of tropical countries, is the lack of land use planning. So in tropical countries, when we talk about biodiverse landscapes or high conservation value landscapes, there is very limited land use planning and enforcement of that land use plannings. So for example, the go zones and no-go zones are not very clearly defined. Second, the communities, the smallholder farmers that are living in these landscapes, they have very limited access to services. For example, very limited access to extension services provided by the authorities, or access to high quality seeds, access to market, having the financial capital to establish local enterprises. And in many cases, these farmers also have very insecure land titles. Moreover, the governance in many, in fact, most of the tropical countries is quite weak, which also does not protect farmers from smallholder farmers, particularly from land grabbing. Similarly, when we look at the distribution, there is a lot of food wastage in the distribution process, and that the waste is different also across different countries. For example, in low-income countries, the waste tends to happen during the distribution process, but in high-income countries, the waste tends to happen at the consumption level. Similarly, when we talk about the consumption, our food habits have changed dramatically, right? So for example, we expect that we will need to produce 70% more food by 2050 because of the demand that's coming from high growth middle income countries like China and Brazil and now India as well, where the diet of the population is shifting to more meat-based diet. So the consumption pattern are also driving the unsustainable land use change. So far I have talked about the impact of the food system at a macro level on biodiversity, the underlying drivers, and then I will very briefly talk about the solutions that we need to put in place. So first, we absolutely have to develop integrated land use plans. So in the high conservation value areas where we are observing increased deforestation, we have to develop a land use plan that identify go zones and no-go zones. and then in the go zones, support the local farmers to organize themselves to, for example, set up community enterprises for them to be able to have better access to market, for them to be able to have better access to farm inputs like high yielding seeds and high yielding clones. So once that setup, once that system is set up, we have the land use plan, we have the communities organized. We need to overlay a digital system that is able to track what the farmers are producing and where they are selling, and where they are selling, as well as the whole supply chain. So for that, we need to first register the farmers in these buffer zones, so which includes, for example, their geospatial location, their the crops that they are planting, but are their farming practices, whether they are best recommended practices or not. So once all the registration details of those farmers are captured, we also need to track all the transactions from farmers to the end buyers. So for example, we are piloting one such application for rubber in the landscape in Myanmar. So we are working with the local traders and the factory owners, as well as, of course, the smallholder farmers to track the supply chain of rubber. So where now the farmers, when they are selling rubber to traders, they are capturing all the transactions. The system is capturing all the transactions. And when the trader sells the rubber to the processing factory, that transaction is captured. And when the factory owner sells the rubber to their international buyer, they capture that transactions. So with that, that provides us incredible amount of data that is absolutely needed for us to monitor whether there is a system in place that incentivizes farmers to not do any further deforestation, as well as to protect the protect the no-go zones around their areas. So once that system is set up, it has incredible number of benefits. So this traceability system, which is able to trace the commodity, and I gave the example of rubber. So this gives us the power to also do geospatial monitoring. For example, we can capture the deforestation through satellite, through remote sensing. And once we have the farmer registered in the system, we can overlay any new deforestation with the geospatial coordinate of the farmers. And if there is any new deforestation in the vicinity of the registered farmers, we can do further investigation. And if the farmers who, for example, committed to sustainable food system or sustainable commodity production, if they are responsible for deforestation, they can be easily decoupled from the supply chain, the registered supply chain. Similarly, once we have all this transaction level data, it gives us enormous amount of information in terms of what is the productivity of the farmers. So in that sense, we can have very focused extension services and support the individual farmers in improving their livelihoods. For example, for farmers who are living in buffer zones around high conservation value area, in high conservation value areas, the biggest challenge for them is the livelihoods. And if we support them in strengthening their livelihoods, they are committed to conserving the forests. And such a traceability application also has a huge implication on financial inclusion, because for financial inclusion, the farmers are risky. For mainstream financial institutions, banks, and even microfinance institutions, they are quite reluctant to lend to smallholder farmers. So in that, such a traceability application can provide the historical data that provides those banks, those financial institutions, much needed information to make the decision whether they can lend or not lend to these farmers. So here was we looked at the production side. So we can also similarly look at the distribution side. And once we have mapped how the food or your crop is going through various nodes, you can also track the losses that are happening within that transaction. It's usually happens during the storage stage. So this traceability system can also help in understanding where the food waste is happening, and then support those stakeholders in taking appropriate action to contain that food waste. And last but not the least, the post-COVID recovery. And we have seen in last 4 months that COVID has impacted the food system quite profoundly. And the impact is not over yet. We will see more impact throughout the rest of the year. But traceability system can also play an important role, both in terms of providing immediate relief to smallholders and enterprises, SMEs. Because if the traceability system is two ways, for example, if the payment system is also integrated in the traceability system, then it is very easy for governments to administer immediate relief through such a traceability system. And in countries, tropical countries, in many tropical countries, for example, Myanmar, the um, uh, the ability of the government to also provide immediate relief is also limited. So in such cases, such a tool can also be quite beneficial in administering immediate reliefs. So in terms of long-term recovery, we need to promote, again, we have to make sure that the long-term recovery is green, that it respects nature, that the high conservation value areas are not bulldozed, they are protected. So we need to create a recovery in the sense that it creates incentives to protect nature. And this is where the traceability tool can also play a role. For example, in the case of rubber example that I mentioned earlier, the traceability tool gives us a very clear history that certain stakeholders, certain SMEs, certain farmers, they are following the sustainable production guidelines. They are producing their commodities sustainably. So if the post-COVID recovery can provide more incentive to those specific entities, those specific individuals, to not just recover but also play a role in conserving nature, that will both support them to survive in medium term, but also help in recovering the economy more sustainably. So I briefly highlighted the benefits of such a traceability system, but again, traceability system is not a strategy. The underlying driver is that you have to have an integrated land use plan and you have to organize the farmers. What traceability system does, it really helps you monitor them, whether the farmers and other stakeholders, they are following the sustainable production guidelines, and it makes your monitoring more efficient, it makes it less costly. So with that, I will conclude my presentation, but I'll just mention a couple of points in terms of what role common people can play in conserving forests, and wildlife in terms of when it comes to food system. So first is we really have to change our diet, right? So as we are seeing in many countries like China and Brazil, and even increasingly in India, there is increased trend towards meat-based diet, which is also not good for your health. So having well-balanced diet is important. It not just benefit you, but it will also benefit nature. Second, we have to also demand more action from our governments. So we have to ask our government to protect nature, and we have to make sure, we have to demand that the green recovery that most of the governments are now putting forward, they don't have rent-seeking behavior. They are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and other multilateral environmental agreements, such as the Paris Agreement and Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. And thank you, and I would like to thank again Cropin for giving us the opportunity.
Thank you, Gaurav, for that insightful session on ensuring biological diversity for a sustainable future. Coming up next is Kavit Kumar Muruganathan, who is an agri-commodity sustainability specialist and a visiting faculty member at the Technical University of Munich. He has also worked with Halcyon Agri in his past stints. Kavik is going to talk about a little bit more on the rubber value chain and its alignment to the UN's SDG goals. Thank you, Kavik, for joining us. Over to you now.
Thanks, Georgie, for the warm introduction, and thanks to Cropin for giving me this opportunity to share on rubber traceability and the SDG alignment. Just to add on, basically I'm from having worked in the natural rubber sector for the last 3 to 4 years. It is one of those industries that is facing constant challenges, just like any other agri-commodity business. The natural rubber sector is currently witnessing record low natural rubber prices, coupled with issues of deforestation, suppressed wages for farmers, and of course illegal logging and any other issues that any other social and environmental issues that come along with it. So without further ado, let me just go into the gist of my presentation today, which would cover traceability within natural rubber supply chains and how we can seek alignment with the SDGs. First of all, I would like to emphasize that traceability, it helps us find solutions, but traceability has to be implemented end-to-end within a supply chain. And this will be covered on in greater detail in the subsequent part of my webinar. Alignment to the SDGs are also very multifaceted. We all know that there are 17 SDGs, but what's very interesting is many of these SDGs are actually interconnected and overlapping in nature. Technology is also an enabler. That's something that we have actually realized, having used some of Cropin's tools and algorithms to enable traceability within our supply chains. And what's more impactful is using data from our traceability studies to create positive social impact. So this will be the gist of my sharing with you in today's session. Natural rubber traceability offers tremendous risk and opportunity in natural rubber supply chains, where we can actually harness technology to identify some of these risks and opportunities. We also are using technology to enable technical literacy within the supply chains, especially for smallholder farmers and of course dealers that are within those supply chains, and actually helping them to use technology to create social mobility. The use of technology can be multifaceted as well. We have seen the use of technology to identify gender proportions within natural rubber supply chains, which actually tie in with some of the SDGs of the United Nations. Monthly income is also an issue that we have seen within the natural rubber supply chain that calls for immediate action. With lower natural rubber market prices, we are seeing the incomes of smallholder farmers plummet as well. Many of them are actually earning below the national minimum wages of their respective nations. What's also interesting to know is that smallholder farmers actually form close to 95% of the natural rubber supply chain in the world. So basically, it's a very disconnected, disorganized supply chain, very much different from your palm oil supply chains, which seem to have a bit more structure. So how do we actually reach out to these farmers? And that's where technology comes in handy, where we can use applications provided by Cropin, companies like Cropin, to actually touch base with farmers, collect very specific data that relates to their income, their gender profile, and of course, touching on to the next issue of density and plantation. So basically the number of trees they've planted, how much land they own, and of course, this will give an insight on the yield that they can actually generate from their plantations. And of course, as every commodity businesses, I think rubber trees have a sell-by date as well. And when it comes to rubber, you're looking at a age productivity that can extend till the age of about 25 to 30 years. And beyond that, the productivity of natural rubber trees actually drop tremendously. So age can give us very strong insights on how we can derive potential long-term yield data for a set of farmers within a given area. Working hours is also very important. With low rubber prices, we are seeing many farmers actually take on longer working hours and not choosing to hire workers to be on their plantations. So how does working hours actually translate to monthly income? Are they working the stipulated national working hours to earn that desired income, or are they actually overworking and going beyond stipulated working hours within their national jurisdictions. And that is something that we want to, we have actually found out through some of the work that we have done, which I'll share later. And furthermore, we are also doing comparisons between the yield of trees, and the monthly income that farmers derive from these trees in accordance to the number of trees. And this actually gives very fascinating information because natural rubber farmers actually sell their rubber on to dealers within the supply chain. And these dealers actually do not have a very transparent pricing mechanism. So many a times farmers sell on to these dealers based on age-old relationships, past experiences, and just a level of kinship that has been developed over a period of time. So essentially, prices are not transparent. Farmers do not know how market prices of natural rubber is actually calculated. So this creates a situation where there can be unfair payments made to farmers. Farmers are not actually paid the true value of the natural rubber that is actually sold on to the dealers. So technology plays a part in this because technology enables us to collect data. And what is important is that we need to make this data work. We need to leverage on this data to find the risks and opportunities within the supply chain. And those significant risks that we have seen come in the areas of income, come in the areas of yield, and come in the areas of working hours. So if I move on to the next slide, you'll be able to see that we've actually worked on a project, a real life project that extended for about 6 months since the end of last year to somewhere in the middle of this year in a specific province in Indonesia, trying to map up smallholder farmers in a natural rubber supply chain. And this project actually targeted close to about 1,000 smallholder farmers. And what we actually found was relatively fascinating. It also actually helped us to reinforce some of the preconceived notions we had about the natural rubber industry. Many of the issues centered upon 17 SDGs, which we actually cascaded down further into 6 core goals, 6 core UN SDGs. As I've said earlier, many of these UN SDGs are actually mutually reinforcing. They are actually overlapping. So, sometimes some of the issues that we found on the ground can actually cross-cut several of these SDGs. And I think that's the beauty of the UN SDGs. It gives us room for maneuver. It is not very rigid, but it can be very all-encompassing in certain sense. So UN SDG 1, 5, 8, 10, 11, and 15 were the ones that we actually targeted through this project. And what we have actually realized is that many of these trees of the farmers that were actually surveyed and interviewed actually were providing low yields, and this actually resulted in lower incomes that were actually below minimum wage of Indonesia. So, and that given province actually. So basically this pointed to the idea that there has to be some sort of new investment that needs to be come into new planting efforts. So and with smallholder farmers, I think their access to finance is limited. Many of them do not have land title deeds. Many of them do not have land registration records. So when they go to the local banks, it's hard for them to obtain any sort of collateral, provide any sort of collateral to take on loans for new planting efforts. So this is a paradigm shift where we need the financial institutions to actually come in to see how they can actually finance smallholder farming, especially for the natural rubber industry, where 95% of the rubber comes from smallholder farmers all across the world. So this is an issue that actually requires immediate intervention. This is a issue of high risk that needs to be solved by all stakeholders within the natural rubber industry. And we actually also realized that farmers also needed some form of extension services in the form of capacity building, extension services in the form of how to improve yields through good tapping practices, in the form of access to fertilizers to improve soil quality that would actually improve yield, and of course extension services in the form of market knowledge, knowing how much they should be getting for their rubber from their dealers, also knowing how much that they should be paying their dealers for the rubber, and whether there can be other better markets that can serve them to get a better price for their rubber. So it's multifaceted. So this extension service is actually required on the ground, and we are seeing a lack of it in Indonesia and also many parts of the world. And this was actually reinforced through our case study pilot in this province of Indonesia. And to sort of also wrap things up, we also found that data needs to be ground truthed because many of times these are all qualitative answers that we are getting from farmers. So a lot of ground truthing is also required. So what we also propose is also to revisit farmers on a periodic basis to review and verify this information. And of course, also harness other forms of technology, for example, satellite imaging, to basically verify areas of rubber growing areas, to actually verify the hectare size of farmer land, farmer plots, and of course verifying the density of the trees, because the density within a plot of land would actually translate to the potential yield that you can derive from that piece of land. So just sort of put pin to things, I think traceability is a crucial element within the natural rubber supply chain, given the fact that how disconnected and disjointed it is. And technology can be an enabler, but of course the whole issue is also about scalability. How do we get this technology to proliferate and to be in the hands of as many people as possible? So it's also about improving tech literacy within farmers and dealers. It's also about creating the relevant technological infrastructure. So whenever we do projects in some parts of the world, we find that technology could be a barrier because in certain areas there's a lack of internet connectivity, there's lack of signal, so data cannot be collected and stored on our devices. So that's an issue as well. And of course, the whole issue is about scalability. Again, I think I can't re-emphasize more on this because I think that's fundamental if we want to reach out to as many farmers as possible within the natural rubber supply chain. Of course, we can talk about representative sampling, but of course, I think issues will vary from region to region, province to province, and geography to geography. So some of the issues faced by Indonesian farmers might not be the same as the issues faced by the Ivorian farmers. So it's always very interesting to see how technology can be an enabler, and of course how technology can actually triangulate with traceability and help to align organizations with SDGs, the 17 UN SDGs. And I think a lot of organizations have started doing this. And I think the whole idea is for organizations to come across within the industry to collaborate to ensure that change can be created at the industry level. And of course, how we make use of data. So data sharing is also required among organizations because data can be impactful, and aggregated data is especially more impactful because I think therein lies valuable information that can be used to create positive change. So with this, I think I will end my sharing here and pass on my time to the next speaker.
Well, that was a very insightful session by Kevik, where he spoke about the socio-economic and agronomic parameters that impact the natural rubber value chain and its alignment to SDG. Next coming up is David Behrens, who is the head of global coffee trade and managing partner at Sucafina. David comes with an extensive experience in coffee trading and traceability and blockchain systems. And he's going to be talking about how do we ensure an effective coffee value chain from bean to cup. David, we are absolutely delighted to have you today. Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David, as was mentioned. I am the head of trading of Sucafina, and it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'd like to thank the Cropin team in particular for the nice invite, and it's great to be with such wonderful panelists, many of whom I've already learned from. So I would like to start off and just retouch on Sucafina's vision, just very briefly before getting into the topic at hand. It is to be the leading sustainable farm-to-roaster coffee company in the world. And there's two words in there that I want to focus on. One is leading. When we talk about leading, we don't mean the largest. Of course, we'd love it to mean the most profitable, but that's oftentimes not the case. But for us, it really means innovation and impact, and also the ability to inspire the coffee industry. When we talk about sustainability, oftentimes many people think of helping farmers, and definitely that's a part of what our vision is. However, when we talk about sustainability, we start with economic sustainability, meaning that all actors in the supply chain need to be profitable, because if there's not economic viability, then there's no chance to invest into social and environmental improvement. And at Sukafina, we have very much the motto of doing things open source and explaining what we're doing. So I'm very happy to be with each of you and talk a little bit about the coffee supply chain and some of the exciting things we're doing. Going to the next slide. Under opportunities, I would say that the coffee industry is going through somewhat of a changing cycle due to the digitalization. First of all, most change starts with the consumer, and we're seeing millennial and post-millennial generation consumer who they're digital natives. They expect to have data given to them very rapidly, and many of them are leery of large brands and claims that are being made. There's oftentimes an adage of prove it to me. And so there's a real push towards traceability and transparency that's coming from those consumers. The next group, brands and retailers, are trying to figure out how to address that, but also how to find new ways of engagement. We've seen that with the COVID world, that a lot less sales are happening in coffee shops themselves, and you've seen more sales moving to online and people buying their coffee for anything else. And I think what's interesting is when people buy a product in a supermarket, they oftentimes pick up the product and it's the packaging and looking at the packaging that they make a decision. But now with online purchasing, it's really all about the data that can be provided. And the competitive advantage is where you really can have deeper engagement. And we believe that that traceability and transparency is the perfect way to engage the new consumer. Processors and traders, people like Sukafina, as we get more digitally equipped, we're able to have deeper insights into our supply chain. In the past, we might process coffee in lots of different wet mills and dry mills, and we'd never really be able to compare how good are we at it. Is one washing station that's 10 kilometers away from another washing station processing at the same efficiency? Now with the digitalization, almost in real time, we're able to have better analytics and better information. Additionally, we know that not everything is perfect in our supply chain. So also as we go through the process of digitalization, we're finding the problems. So it's also the weak spots in our supply chain where we have room for improvement. And lastly, with traceability, we really want to know the impact of all the sustainability work that we're doing, because we spend a lot of time and money engaging farmers, and now it's truly possible to measure that impact. Lastly, we have farmers and cooperatives that are beginning to use these digital tools. On one side, farmers and cooperatives are staying engaged more in precise agriculture, and we're seeing that really being a new trend that's happening in the world of coffee to boost yields and to lower the cost of production. Additionally, many times when I speak to farmers, they're almost more interested in being connected to the global ecosystem. And what do I mean by that? They spend so many months, almost an entire year, taking care of trees and preparing them for the flowering and then the ripening stage, and then finally they get to the harvest stage and they pick the perfectly red, ripe coffee beans that are needed to provide the premium experience for the consumer. But when they go and they sell that product, ultimately it leaves and they never know what happens after that. There's never any validation for all of the work that they've done. And I think what's exciting about digitalization is that data can flow not only from the farmer to the consumer, but data can flow back to the farmer themselves. And lastly, I see them using more digital tools for differentiation to be able to obtain better pricing, and ultimately for those who are buying the product to be able to again differentiate between a farmer who is doing all of the social environmental work on their farm versus somebody who's not doing any of that. I think on the agenda side of things, so those are all the opportunities that I see and the direction that the coffee supply chain is moving. From the agenda side of things, I think digitalization is a great start. I mean, I would tell everybody, we need to move away from analog paper receipts that are getting signed in contracts and paperwork. And even when we talk about digitalization, sometimes people want to scan a piece of paper, put it in a PDF document, and put it into a silo. And I think that really doesn't help in a more meaningful way. What we really need to be able to do is doing digitalization in a way that has a sense of standardization so that data can be passed from one player to another player, or it could be potentially validated by a third player, for example, like Rainforest Alliance. And lastly, I think that we need to recognize on digitalization that this is bigger than any one company or one organization. There's not going to be one player who's going to have all of the data concentrated with them. So what really becomes important is as companies and startups start to work on digitalization will be the interoperability. And what do I mean by that? I mean the ability for data to get collected under one network and to be passed to another network without losing all of the credentials and all of the proof of validity of the data that had been there. The second point on the agenda that I'd like to point out is that data ownership matters. Now, maybe many of you will disagree with the statement I'm going to say, but I think we messed up when we set up the internet. Today, we as individuals do not own most of our data when we transact on the internet. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody. We've almost come to a point where we've accepted it, but I don't think that that's the right way forward. I think that it's important that each actor in the supply chain who uploads data onto a system can actually be the owner of that data. I don't think any third party or company should be the owner of that data. And I think it all starts with farmers. My vision and the vision of Sukafina is that we would like farmers to own their data, to be able to control their data, and to ultimately be able to monetize their data. Because we think that ultimately, as consumers become hungry and hungrier for this traceability and transparency, that the value of the data might actually someday be worth more than the coffee itself. So it's really an idea of selling coffee plus data. The third point on the agenda is really about connectivity, and I don't think this is a surprise for anybody. Mobile phone penetration rates that we've seen today, even SMS and flip phones, is what's really leading the digital revolution in coffee. In many of the countries that we operate in, including East Africa, we're starting to see 60, 70, 80% penetration of mobile phones, which really allows for that connectivity to happen. But it's critical as we build the new digital ecosystem. And then lastly, harnessing data for good is a team sport. And what I mean by that is a lot of companies want to use farmer sustainability work, they want to use traceability and transparency as a competitive advantage. But we really believe that it should be a competitive necessity for the entire industry. It's the issues we're trying to tackle are way too big for any one company, and I think it's really important that we come together in a pre-competitive way. And as mentioned, Sukafina, we're perfectly committed to working open source. We're happy to share what we're doing, even with competitors of ours, if it can lead to us all working again on a pre-competitive basis to help improve the livelihood of the farmers who are growing the coffee in the world that we face. So as we move on to the next slide, if possible, I'd like to just share a little bit of specifics about Sukafina and some of the things that we're doing. Currently in East Africa, we're in the process of migrating 75,000 smallholder farm records in Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda via Croppin. So that's our collaboration with Croppin, and we think we'll probably add a similar number next year. In addition to that, we're also working with another startup company named Farmer Connect, which does digital identity for farmers and blockchain solutions. And I think what's important about this is that we're at the point where we're finally gathering a lot of primary data around our supply chains. And that gives us better understanding. It gives us better insights. It allows us to tackle sustainability issues and actually see what I was referring to earlier, a return on investment. If we go in and do work that's supposed to improve yields, we now have digital proof of the impact that we're having. And I think that's very exciting, as well as opening up new ways of communicating with farmers via SMS tools or whatever they might be, but engaging farmers in a way where the farmers are keeping a digital record of their production, their income, and the quality that's being produced. And at the same time, Sukafina is getting validation from the farmer that they've paid a fair price and that the coffee that they're sourcing is coming from farmers who truly are sustainable. I think that those things are critical for some of the items that I've listed up above. We're combining them with satellite imagery and with carbon mapping in some cases, and all of that is data. And we have to think about how all of that data can get stored in one place or in multiple places that can be used. And so that's where the start of us using the blockchain solution with Farmer Connect came about, where for me, blockchain is just a technology. It's just an end of the means. If a better technology came about tomorrow, we'd be happy to use it. I know there's been a lot of hype about blockchain, but for us, what's really nice about blockchain is that it's very secure. So it's the same technology that is behind Bitcoin, and we know that the hacking of those systems has never happened. Number two, it's immutable, meaning that once somebody has entered that data onto the blockchain, so in this case, if a farmer and Sukafina both have an agreement at a price that coffee has, there's for the farmer a digital record that's stored under their identity, and Sukafina, the first block on the blockchain, now has farmer confirmed pricing. And all of that data goes forward from Sukafina to the roaster and ultimately to the consumer. And I think that we're starting to see more engagement coming. We just had an announcement of a project we did with the group Smuckers in the United States. They have a specialty coffee brand, 1850, where they were able to put a QR code on the package. And through that QR code, their consumers were able to learn more about the product. They were able to learn, see the map, the journey that the coffee had taken itself, be able to see any certificates that came, let's say in the case of Rainforest, if it had been Rainforest Alliance approved, they'd see those certificates and that validation. And lastly, they're able to engage directly back with the consuming or to the producing communities. So in that sense, there's this form of crowdsourced funding where, first of all, consumers can just learn about the efforts that are being done on the ground. But if they want, they're actually able to make a contribution. Because I think that when we talk about tracing and blockchain, I don't think it's only applicable to the product itself, but it's also very valid for the tracing of payments. Because many times we know that one of the hurdles that happens in the coffee supply chain, and I guess in other supply chains, is it's very difficult to know, are those premiums that are getting paid actually making it back to the farmer? So one of the things we've been very conscious of is having digital records, digital payments going back to the farmer and being able to trace those payments as well. So those are some of the things that we as Sukafina are doing today. If I had more time, I would definitely love to expand on other items that we have that were happening that I mentioned on the slide, but we might have to save that for another time. So thank you for listening and being a part of this, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have when we come to the Q&A part of the session. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was a power-packed session by David. Thank you so much for joining us, David. Next up, we are going to talk about one of my favorite ingredients, which is cocoa. And we have Henk van Rekoot, who is the head of farm intelligence at Rainforest Alliance. He's going to be talking about how he is expanding the use of individual digital farm development plans for cocoa producers in West Africa. Thank you, Henk, for joining us. Over to you now.
Thank you, and hello to everybody that is on the webinar today. Great that you are joining us. My name is Henk van Rekoot. I'm based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and I'm with the Rainforest Alliance. And the Rainforest Alliance is a global organization, and an important area of our work is on developing sustainable supply chains. I'm sure that you are familiar with our logo. That's a little green frog that you can find on products such as coffee, tea, chocolate, bananas, etc. And our organization is called an alliance, as we are doing this work in close collaboration with many other organizations, businesses, corporations, as well as governments, producers, smallholder farmers, and also technology companies such as Cropping. Now, this webinar is about traceability and the importance of knowing where agri-products are coming from, a trusted, safe, and sustainable source. And in my talk today, I will zoom in on our work on creating that sustainable source and on the growing role of technology in achieving sustainability at the farm level. And to illustrate this with a case, we will zoom in on the cocoa industry and related supply chains. Cocoa is the main ingredient of chocolate. It's a traded commodity of which the majority is produced in West Africa, in Ivory Coast and Ghana, to be precise. In terms of sustainability in origin of cocoa production, there are many challenges. An important one is a poor economic conditions of the farmers that are producing cocoa. Many of them are living well below the poverty line. Low production, poor and further declining yields from cocoa farms are an important driver for this. To address this, the Rainforest Alliance started 3 years ago an initiative that we're calling Farm Grow. And we are doing this with several other organizations. And the Grameen Foundation is being an important organization in this particular work. Farm Grow is a digital application that is functioning as a long-term individualized coaching plan that is helping smallholder farmers to use responsible methods to increase productivity on existing cocoa land as much as threefold. The process starts with a visit from staff from a cocoa trader to a cocoa farmer that is interested in joining Farm Grow. Based on an extensive interview, a socio-economic profile of the farmer is developed. And this typically includes information such as composition of the farming household, income stream from cocoa and other income generating activities, the investment capacity on the farm, and the ambitions and the plans of the household. Next to the family's socio-economic profile, all the cocoa plots of the farmer are visited, and for each plot, the current agronomic status is assessed. And think here of observable agronomic parameters like the cocoa variety planted, what kind of clone is it, the age of the cocoa trees, the quality of the soil, and the techniques used by the farmer for farm maintenance activities, such as pruning, for example. The Farm Grow tool and underlying logic is then using the collected information to suggest a 10-year intervention and investment plan with the goal to get from a production of an approximate of 450 kilograms of cocoa, and this is the current average cocoa production in Ghana, to 1,500 kilograms per hectare. And this tripled production translates to a much better economic position for the farmer over time. The application is able to tweak the intervention plan based on the investment capacity and ambitions of the family. The plan and its implications are discussed with the farming family, and buy-in from the whole family in the plan is needed. And this has proven, doing this in the field, to be a critical success factor. After the agreement on following the plan, regular coaching and monitoring sessions are planned to guide the farmer on a personal level and address potential hiccups in following the plan. That, in short, is what Farm Grow is all about. Now, as you probably picked up from this short introduction on Farm Grow, it's an intensive process. So it's manual data collection, and it's intense in terms of data collection and monitoring. And for this reason, the Rainforest Alliance partnered with Cropin, as we are keen to develop data products that can make the monitoring of our interventions at farm level, at scale, much more accurate and cost effective. And I will illustrate the work that we are doing with Cropin via two examples that we are currently working on. The first one is on a model to predict the black pot disease in cocoa production. And the second one is the work that we are doing on predicting a cocoa yield model. Black pot disease is a devastating disease that can wipe out cocoa yields very strongly. And of course, this is very harmful for farms, for all farms, but especially for farms where a lot is invested by the farmer on getting a better yield, and where a lot of costs are already being made. And we are trying to address this together with Cropin, and we are working with the team and together with implementers on the ground, so cocoa farmers as well as cocoa traders, to collect a variety of data from infested and non-infested black pot disease areas, both current and historical data. And this data often includes remote sensing data. So those are basically images, pictures that are taken from the Earth, from satellites. From this data, we are working, and that is the work that the cropping team is doing, and it's very specific, skilled work. We are working on building a predictive algorithm that can predict the occurrence of the disease, of the black pot disease. And of course, this is very valuable for farmers, so they have the time to act accordingly and address such diseases before it becomes hard to manage them. So much in the same way, by collecting data in the field, on the ground, together with farmers, by observing cocoa, as well as data from digital sources, remote sensing, other digital sources, databases of other organizations, by developing draft algorithms, draft data models, and by testing these models, these predictive models in the field, we are working with Cropin on a yield model. And this model will be able to predict the yield of a cocoa plot. As you see here on this slide, a glimpse of that development work. So the testing of many observable factors and determined from that the correlation or not with cocoa yield, and how this can be captured in a predictive model that can be applied and rolled out in the field together with farmers. Being able to predict yield is valuable to Rainforest Alliance, FarmGrow, and many other actors in the value chain, farmers, of course, central, as we can determine remote which farmers may need extra support in working on implementing their FarmGrow plans. How this may work, for example, is that we spot a low predicted cocoa yield, and based on that kind of alert or sign to certain people in organizations that we work with, a coach is sent to the farmer to check in with the farmer and see what is going on the field or other problems, and so we can much better address issues early on in the production stage. The work on developing the black pot disease model and as well the yield model is not yet finished, but it's looking very promising in terms of interim testing results, and we will continue to further develop this and hopefully roll this out at scale. While the challenges that the Rainforest Alliance is focusing on are often not technical, but socioeconomic or environmental, technology, so data, digitalization, geomapped farm locations, that is changing the way that the Rainforest Alliance is offering value to farmers and supply chain actors. And we are investing together with companies like Cropin in specific data products, often based on remote sensing, that we do not want to develop in-house. And these products add value to the supply chain by preventing or better management of pests and diseases, for example, and other data-driven decision-making that is often reducing the risk for smallholder farmers. This work, the work that I talked about today, is focusing very much on achieving sustainability at origin, at the farm level. Traceability, the ability to know the exact origin of cocoa throughout the supply chain, is of course essential to connect sustainable cocoa to the markets for it. For the Rainforest Alliance, these innovations are not per se a goal in itself, yet we are convinced that they will become more and more relevant in our work on sustainable supply chains and advancing the socio-economic position of small farmers. This is the end of my presentation. Many thanks for joining us today. I hope we can continue with some interesting questions and a small discussion. And otherwise, feel free to reach out to me via email.
Thank you, Henk, for that session. Coming up next is Arjun Datta, who is the Director of Sales Asia Pacific at Cropin. Arjun leads business development and delivery of farming solution services in Southeast Asia. His work focuses on AI and machine learning to drive farm digitization, predictability, traceability, and sustainability in the agricultural sector. He is going to talk about the use cases that Cropin has implemented for traceability. Thank you, Arjun, for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Jyoti, for the opportunity. With the implementation of digital technologies, new biotechnological solutions, and leapfrogging developments of robotics, Agriculture has a brand new reputation. Investors sure sense the potential. They are investing billions into agri-food tech now. Today, each component of an extensive food supply system is being digitized. And in the future, each component could create new specific markets. There's also a big need to increase the labor efficiency of agriculture, the quality of products, and supply chain transparency. Agriculture businesses have many private contractors. How can the documents flowing between them remain transparent? For starters, the entire chain needs to be digitized. Introduce digital signatures, secure transactions, reduce fraud. Moving food closer to consumers. In the past couple of years, I've had the privilege to meet organizations who have gone aggressive in vertical farming, right? So they are being able to grow plants much efficiently across the seasons, no weather challenge. They are in fact providing these farms on residential buildings, hotels, etc. Another important area I must say is cold storage and warehousing. India, as an example, is the largest producer of fruits and second largest producer of vegetables in the world. In spite of that, per capita availability of fruits and vegetables is quite low because of post-harvest losses, which account to about 25 to 30% of production. Besides, quality of sizable quantity of produce also deteriorates by the time it reaches the consumer. Most of the problems relating to the marketing of fruits and vegetables can be traced to their perishability. Perishability is responsible for high marketing cost, market gluts, price fluctuations, and other similar problems. And I'm glad that the government has allocated funds to address cold chain and post harvest management infra gaps. The other aspect is food safety and transparency. Blockchain addresses consumer food safety as to enables real-time tracking of produce from farm to fork. This tends the B2B level of transactions with anyone, anywhere with no trust issues. Its ability of tracking ownership records and tamper resistance, ability to solve food fraud, safety recalls, supply chain inefficiency, and food traceability in the current food system is what makes this technology so promising. We haven't reached there yet. The major challenges are literacy of the farmers, government regulations around cryptocurrencies, cost, and certain complexity of the supply chain. So these days, when we talk about trends, we see a lot of farming is all about informed decision making now. It's not only for the large agri enterprises anymore. That trend is shifting and quite rapidly. The farmer has to make decisions. The businesses have to make decisions. It becomes more and more important that the decisions are informed decisions now. The need for technologies that give the farmer organizations, the businesses, and the entire chain actionable insights, at any point of time is therefore growing. Number two, the other trend which agri-tech organizations and farming businesses have realized is that no one size fits all. The solution that have been working well for large farms or specific geos doesn't necessarily mean it will work for marginal farmers or any geography for that matter. When it comes to agronomy advisors, which is important in boosting yields, quality, and productivity, is provided mostly at a large scale. Individual fields and variations within them are not factored in. Be it for small or large farms, technology plays an important role in monitoring as well as providing hyperlocal solutions. It needs to be scalable and it needs to be cost efficient. Number three, artificial intelligence. AI based farming is the future and it helps to not only ease the farmer's load but also make food production more sustainable, improve the ecological situation. There are organizations and governments now who are actively working on ecology balance and tying that produce. Satellites, IoTs, drones, monitoring, and actionable insights are getting better providing such ROI. Digitizing the entire supply chain, right? With the increase of smartphone penetration in the emerging markets, it's only a matter of time that the farming operations, businesses, and the supply chain will be digitized. Eventually, economies will have to move from an unorganized to an organized supply chain sooner than later. The other upcoming trend that we are noticing now and probably in the next couple of years, and it's going to be very important, is artificial food and vegetable meat market. The world is inevitably shifting towards vegetable meat, and already it's being offered in a few fancy restaurants. Well, apart from the cost of production, the taste, the most important challenge here is gaining consumer trust. So we are not there yet, but we are surely getting there. Lastly, the consumer oriented food production. The consumers have started demanding farm to fork produce and would like to learn and pay for the entire journey. All the consumers need to do is, pick up the phone, order your product targeted towards you. There would be time when consumers would prefer food of certain origin, shapes, tastes, and supply chain should be able to adapt to such market changes. Even the farmers will need to adapt to these changes. They will not grow something because of historical knowledge. Will grow produce that is demanded by the consumers. Okay, this particular case is about Pagraxo. It's a subsidiary of the government of Punjab project. This project intends to employ a traceability solution for Pagraxo, produce the potato seeds, and streamline the entire seed certification process. So Punjab accounts for 5% of India's total potato output. Currently, less than 1% of total potato farm area certified by the Punjab Seed Certification Authority. The absence of well-developed certification process has resulted in the rampant sale of fake and subpar potato seeds in the name of Punjab-grown potato seeds, which has severely impacted the credibility and the brand value of the genuinely high-quality seeds. To curb this issue, Pagraxo has partnered with Crop-In Technology, and to not only enhance the overall quality of seeds produced, but also implement the first of its kind seed potato traceability solution in the potato value chain. So the primary objectives were create a QR code based authentication system, geotag farm plots to establish origin of the seeds to the exact farm location, and to enable end-to-end traceability. Enable Pagraxo to maintain, develop, and meet quality standards for the national as well as international exports. Most importantly, prevent seed counterfeiting. Once you start tracking the origin of the food and create trustworthy food supply chains, it builds trust between the producers and the consumers. And the Cropin platform makes it very difficult or impossible to change, hack, or cheat the system. Our platform is able to cater to all the protocols in terms of seed multiplications, real-time monitoring, and tracking of the package of practices. Each and every process that is being followed from the plot to store are now being digitized and tracked on a real-time basis. We have also worked on a clone-proof QR codes that cannot be replicated using any medium. Tamper-proof stickers to withstand adverse environmental conditions, customizable labels to include additional branding elements. Similarly, we are replicating for the organic value chain as well. So our platform ensures organic standard compliance and traceability till end consumer and strengthens the entire farmer livelihood program as well. See, the major data points that help track progress on these objectives are the farming economics, tracking farmer payments, especially premiums paid to the farmers for following organic practices, health of the crop to estimate production and reduce losses, GMO tests to maintain the integrity of seed and final produce, seed to shelf traceability solutions to preserve the entire global food integrity. And as of now, this system is being used to monitor 35 lakh metric tons and more than 37,000 farmers with Pagraxo. And we have recently started working on basmati rice's traceability as well, and that's additional 30,000 farmers with them. And these were few of the case studies, success case studies, which we discussed on Pagraxo. But apart from this, we are extensively working on a complete traceability for coffee, and that includes organic coffee in Africa, Vietnam, Indonesia, as well as Philippines. Fresh produce and agro processing organizations globally, a lot of them use our platform for entire traceability up to their warehouse level or the processing unit or a complete consumer level traceability as well. Even the government projects that we are currently involved with, The scope is around creating a complete agriculture data system with visibility from a regional level to an individual plot level and the complete traceability of the produce. So with that, I just want to reiterate the value of agri-digitization and the future possibilities it plays. With that, I would be happy to take any questions you might have at the end, and sincerely thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Arjun. And that brings us to the end of all the sessions. We now have some time for Q&A, and we would be taking down questions from the audience. In the interest of time, like I had mentioned earlier, please do send us the question and the name of the speaker to whom you would want to ask the question, and we will try and accommodate as many questions as possible. So our first question is from Kivi Rai, who asks David, how do we actually apply digitalization in the tea or coffee trade as a blender and packer of tea so that we can be able to trace every single packet that finds its way to the consumer?
Okay, great. Thank you. That's a great question, and I think it's something that a lot of us deal with, especially when you're dealing with smallholder farmers. In particular, we know that you have an aggregation process that has to happen because you're taking very small amounts of, in our case, coffee, and it's getting put together with somebody else's coffee. Washing station in East Africa that we manage traditionally would have 100 farmers delivering to it every single day. So the system that we've devised is first we have a digital record of everything that the farmers are bringing each day. So we have batches, and let's say that the batch from day one is going to consist of 100 farmers. The batch from day two is also going to consist of, let's say, a different 100 farmers. And in that case, as we go into the blending process and as we go into the processing, if we take the coffee from batch one and the coffee from batch two and we put the two of those together, now anything that comes out of that new aggregate has to have come from potentially up to 200 farmers. So as you go through more and more blending, you find that the number of farmers who could have contributed to that specific coffee continues to increase. But through the digital record keeping that we have in part with Cropin and part with Farmer Connect, also the processing stage and ultimately to the FOB, we're able to say with confidence that the coffee that's getting exported could have come from this list of farmers. But it really is all done on mass aggregation. There's no way for us to say out of these 10 million beans, these 10 specific beans came from this specific farm as of today.
Great, thanks, David. The next question is for Kevik, and this is asked by Nathan Patel. And this is very specifically for rubber value chain. The digitized technology seems to play the role of eliminating the middlemen and thus force their predatory habits on the fewer farmers they interact with. Have you ever considered working with the middlemen?
Okay, thank you for the question. It's very true that there's currently what we are seeing in the natural rubber value chain. There's a lopsided value distribution very clearly. So the farmers actually get the smallest bit of the pie, and most of the value is actually attained by the middleman and the processors. So one of the challenges we face is always trying to integrate natural rubber middlemen within this digitization process. But we always face a lot of resistance, primarily due to the fact that they know that if this was done, obviously it would come to light that there's equal value distribution within the supply chain. So I think it's all about equitable value chains. So I think it all has to start from the top. Whether tire majors and processors are actually paying the real value for natural rubber, not just the market value, which is based on the SICOM prices, but what is the real tangible value of that natural rubber. So it should not be a commodity, but it should have more value than just the intrinsic properties of natural rubber. Till we attain that stage, I'm pretty sure that even with digitization, we'll end up having middlemen trying to beat the system, trying to gain greater value, and within the supply chain. And that's one of the reasons why we are facing resistance from middlemen wanting to be part of that system, because that creates transparency. And when there's transparency, then of course the unequal value distribution will come to light. So that is my answer in short. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. The next question is from Nabila. This is for Gaurav. In many places where small local farmers community lives, internet has been a very hard thing to reach. How will you apply a digital traceability system with this limitation?
Sure. So for the system that we are working with, the smallholder farmers, they don't need to have access to internet. So what needs to happen is when the smallholder farmers transact with a trader or they transact with the local enterprise, at that time, the transaction is registered in a system, right? Usually in a handheld device. It is good to have internet connection during that transaction. But even in the cases where there is no internet connection during that transaction, if the trader is able to, in 2 or 3 days, able to go to an area that has internet connection, where those transactions that were captured offline can be uploaded online, this system works. So as long as the trader or the first point of transaction has frequent internet access, the system would work.
Great. Thanks, Gaurav. The next question is again for Kevin. Access to data must be considered as a public good. Systems must be supported by a proper partnership model along the lines of SDG 17 and in support of a public goods approach. So Michelle asks, have you identified a partnership model applicable to cell phone providers, satellite providers, the insurance sector, and ag or forest value chains?
Well, I think thanks again for the question. And I think as of now, I think the answer is no. I think SDG 17 is actually the icing of the cake, actually, of all the goals. And if partnerships are successful, they can be very powerful mechanisms to create social impact. And right now, in natural rubber, it's not the case. I mean, a lot of disjointedness in many aspects. And of course, we can have the technology service providers on board. I mean, we have used technology providers like Propin Services, and we know that they are willing to come on board. But I think beyond that, we need more actors to come on board. We need insurers to come in to underwrite the risk of financing these activities. We need financial institutions to also come in to see how they can actually provide financing at what you call discounted rates for these farmers and for such pilots to kick off, because we are not really at a position to actually see as an ecosystem. We are not really there yet, because I think financial institutions don't understand the risk within this supply chain. They have not actually weighted it well, and hence they are not able to come up with any financial models to actually come and support such pilots. So while we have certain actors who are very strong in what they do, for example, Cropin or any other companies providing traceability and blockchain system solutions, we also need a strong financial backing. And that's very critical as far as we have seen from some of the pilots we've done. And I'm sure that's very similar to some of the other commodities that we are talking about during this session as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. It looks like the next question is from John Jefferson for Henk. What are the differences you see in achieving traceability across different crops and geographies, given the supply chains are so diverse?
Yeah, thanks, John, for the question. That's a good observation indeed. So there are quite some complexities across geographies, countries. You see, for example, often differences in how crops are being sourced. So if you take cocoa, for example, it can be that it's that a bigger trader is buying this at scale, or farmers are organized in a cooperative with a certain level of administration and data available, but also often crops are being bought by small individuals that buy little amounts and sell it further onwards in the supply chain. And also across different crops, you see differences in how the supply chain is being structured. And this is posing indeed challenges for traceability all the way to the end, so all the way to the farmer, to that little plot. And this used to be very difficult with a lot of not digitized data available in the field, little way to structure this. But I think this is where data and technology and digitization is really coming in now, and we see that really changing quite fast.
Great, thanks Hank for the response. The next question is for Arjun from Priyamvada Shankar. It is a perception that a South Asian farmer is not very technologically advanced. Do you agree with this? And if yes, how do you see the adoption of digital solutions by these farmers?
Sure, and thank you for that question. Yeah, it's quite common. It totally also depends on how that technology has been provided to the farmer there. Obviously, in first instance, the farmer is not the one who's going to do a lot of data collection for you. So there is a certain amount of handholding that has to be done. And that's the exact reason why we provide our solutions to the field officers first. And we would want the farmers to receive a lot of advisory. As and when time goes, and that trust building is there, that is when gradually they try to adapt to the platform of ours and the technology. And that's when they start entering data there. But look, there are so many different applications on the market. They don't know what to use when and what not. So proper handholding has to be done. And that's why we have that perception that they're not great at digitizing themselves. It's not true. It's just that they try to play around with multiple applications, but they don't know what benefit they're getting out of it. I hope that answers your question, Priyamvada.
Great, thanks Arjun. Looks like the next question is for Dave from Faryal Ali. What are the challenges in coffee storage and processing? And would you have an idea of how much are the post-harvest losses?
Sure. So thank you, Faryal, for the question. First of all, I think that the biggest challenge for us in processing coffee and the storage is really maintaining the integrity of the traceability information and the certification. If you think of having 10 stacks of coffee, if they're all generic, you can stack 10 stacks high in a warehouse, right? But if one of those is organic, one of those is fair trade, one of those is rainforest, one of those has specific farmer traceability, now you're starting to have to store coffee in different places. So we've seen a real push in a lot of the coffee producing countries. You would have just big stacks or big piles of coffee that would all be together to very specific silos where that integrity of traceability data can actually be maintained. In terms of the loss, it's actually quite minimal that we have. We always say there's no such thing as bad coffee. There's good coffee and there's great coffee. And sometimes the lower quality portion of that, which is the good coffee, there's always a market for it. So we very rarely actually lose coffee itself. I would say that sometimes more where the loss happens is on the farm and the wet mill side of things with the pulp, so the cherry of the coffee, where sometimes that isn't being maximized. And we're always looking at innovative ways to turn that pulp into flour and to fertilizer and other things. But I would say that's probably more the side where coffee, the byproduct.
Great. Thanks, David, for answering that. But there's a follow-up question as well from Claudia, which says, could you please elaborate more on how Sukafina is getting validation from farmers that they received a fair price?
Sure. So one side of that's very easy. We deal directly with farmers, with about 200,000 farmers in our supply chain who we're actually buying directly from. And one of the solutions that we're using with the Farmer Connect team is a module called Farmer ID, which the farmers actually own and control. And when they bring coffee to our washing station, we as Sukafina are able to issue a credential, a digital credential to them, and it can be via internet, SMS, or an internet cafe where they can log on. And effectively it has a price, a quantity, and a quality. And it just says, do you agree that this is the price you're selling at, the quantity and the quality? And by them pressing OK, automatically that credential gets stored under their digital identity. So they now have a track record, a digital track record of production and income that's been verified by Sukafina. And on the flip side of it, that confirmation becomes the first block on the blockchain of our traceability, that now you have a farmer actually confirming that price that's been paid. So that's something that we're using today in Rwanda, Colombia, Brazil, and Vietnam, but it's still in a very small scale. I don't want to oversell it. We're still in the initial stages. There's obviously hurdles and complications. One of the things we learned is when you send an SMS message, it's fine, but to get them to confirm that SMS message, it uses bandwidth and has a price attached to it. So we're always saying, all right, how do we work around that and how do we optimize it? And I think one of my other panelists mentioned it earlier, one solution does not fit all. Each country, each region, each micro region does matter. And I think that that's where those partnerships with telecommunication companies, with banks, and with all the other, what we call the ecosystem, is really important to having success and making that really scalable.
Great, thanks, David, for the answer. The next question is for Henk from Shravya. Could you please let us know the necessity of sustainable reporting? She says to ensure traceability or sustainability, tracking emissions, water usage, etc., parameters like that are necessary. So if you could elaborate on the necessity of sustainable reporting.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. And yes, of course, that is necessary. That is very important. We can have a lot of debates on what we should monitor. Should we really pay a lot of attention to climate change, to emissions, to water usage, or any other parameters? Let's not do that, but let's indeed get good data from the ground. And that used to be, if I look to where we are very active at the Rainforest Alliance, so in origin with coffee, cocoa, oil palm, other crops, that used to be quite difficult. We often in rural areas, very remote. A little digitization going on, little data available, all paper-based. But again, that is changing fast. So the time to collect data is that is bettering. So it takes a little effort, and the digitization makes that we can use it better, faster, analyze it, do a lot of things with it that we couldn't do with the paper databases. And yeah, we see that changing, and that is really important.
Great, thanks, Henk. The next question is again about the natural rubber value chain, and maybe Gaurav and Kevin could look at answering this. What are the end customers saying about their decisions and the price premiums they are willing to pay for traceable rubber? Given that the supply chain is disorganized, it is impossible to achieve 100% traceability. So to what extent is traceability good enough given these realities? Maybe Gaurav, you can take a shot at this first, and then we'll ask Kevin for his thoughts.
Sure, it's actually quite an important question. So from my perspective, we have to understand the benefits of traceability, and from the perspective of a conservation organization, the traceability can play an important role in conserving nature and wildlife. So for us, when we talk about traceability, it's far more important to do traceability in high conservation value areas, in areas of high biodiversity, than doing traceability in low conservation value areas. And also there is a strong correlation between, let's say, environmental risks and social risks. So it is usually in high conservation value areas where farmers also tend to have land tenure insecurity, right? So in that way, so if the end buyers, if the companies, there is also cost attached to traceability, right? So if they need to prioritize, they have to absolutely prioritize the traceability in high conservation value areas versus traceability in low conservation value areas. So second is we talked about that the supply chains they're quite disrupted, right? So they are not organized. So the traceability itself, and I said traceability is not a strategy, right? It's a way for us to implement things, to make things simpler, to make things efficient and less costly, right? So we cannot really get around the need to simplify and support the smallholders and the people who are living in high biodiverse landscape. That it doesn't eliminate that. So that absolutely needs to be done. And then what traceability does, it provides you on top of that a monitoring mechanism, a low-cost monitoring mechanism, and a mechanism through which you can administer your incentives to those communities who are producing these commodities sustainably in high conservation value areas.
Great, thanks, Gaurav. Kevik, would you like to add something to what Gaurav just mentioned for the question?
Yeah, I think a lot of similar thoughts with Gaurav. I think there is always a cost to traceability, and traceability, it's not a solution; it's a means to an end. So a lot of times we get ourselves confused that traceability is a solution, and I think right now the cost of traceability is still high. I think till a day when when it has attained some sort of economies of scale, where it can be replicated and scaled up throughout the supply chain very aggressively, I think that's when we will be able to delve into the true issues facing different supply chains. And I think to that issue of premiums, I think right now, we know, I think the industry knows what sort of premiums they are getting for sustainably certified rubber. So I think certification comes into the play, and of course, there's a premium for FSC certified rubber, which is a slight percentage. But beyond that, how do we disrupt that? How do we ensure that value is distributed across the value chain equally? We can still have a premium for rubber, but if there's lopsided distribution of this value in the supply chain, then there's no point of having a premium, or there's no point of having traceability. So that's my opinion.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kevik. Another question, follow-up question, is again around forest conservation, Gaurav. This is by Frederick. How do you address the concern of forest preservation he specifically talks about cocoa farming system, with cocoa farming system at large scale with consumer perception today?
Yeah, that's a good one. That is a challenge in cocoa. So what we currently are working on, and this is also something where technology is coming in. We are working, and that's a massive exercise together with traders on the ground, cooperatives, to map all the geolocations of individual farmers. So not only the farm state, but the exact location of all the different plots where cocoa is produced. So that's often indeed close to national parks, buffer zones, and forests. And we are working with Cropin, as well as several other technology companies that are specialized in remote sensing data products. And we then look, okay, what is going on in terms of deforestation, farmers entering zones where they should not be, and how can we use that information and those kind of real-time alerts on the ground to work with people that are in contact with farmers, to warn them or to take other actions on the ground that prevents forest loss.
Great. To that, Gaurav, would you like to add anything there on forest conservation?
Well, I think that not much to add, except I think if you look at the history of how we have worked in commodities the last 3-4 decades, 3 decades mainly, the engagement of the governments have been limited, and this is something that we need to work on. And when we look at the certification schemes, the governments have largely been absent in sort of the implementation as well as in the design of those. So that needs to change, where as also mentioned in my presentation, land use planning is really a critical part, and this is where the governments need to be engaged. I mean, there is nothing wrong with large cocoa plantation as long as there is a proper land use planning to it. There is there's an equity involved in the value chain, and the land use planning is based on the conservation of forest, it's based on supporting the livelihoods for the communities. There is nothing wrong with that.
Great, thanks, Gaurav. David, the next question is for you. It's again on blockchain for coffee. This is from Srivatsa. He asks, would like to understand the thesis behind the choice of public versus private blockchain for coffee.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's one that is open to debate. Ultimately, the decision that we made was we went with a private permission blockchain. And why is that? Because ultimately, we need to build an ecosystem. We have a lot of different participants who need to be a part of that ecosystem, and there were concerns around data privacy and the ability to be in control of one's data. And I think what's interesting about blockchain is I always say that it's a delivery mechanism tool. So blockchain doesn't cleanse your data. It doesn't make if you put garbage of data in, it doesn't make it better. I mean, it just takes whatever data is put and it goes through. So it's not something that proves anything, but it is immutable. It is very secure. And for the big brands that we work with, they took comfort in the idea of a private permissioned system. So it means that I, as Sukafina, am able to upload a significant amount of data onto this blockchain platform, and at the same time, I am able to take very specific slivers of that information and share it with other participants. And as I mentioned before, it could be a sliver that I share with Rainforest Alliance for any purchases that we've done that are Rainforest Alliance certified, for them to actually be a validator and have that visibility. And it could be a sliver that goes to my client who I'm actually selling that product to, so that in real time, their systems are actually receiving that information. And that's where we see a lot of the efficiency. In terms of public versus private, I'm not going to tell you that the only blockchain that you should ever use is private permissioned. It's the choice that we made, but I think that obviously there's benefits of a public blockchain, and I wouldn't say that anybody shouldn't look at the public blockchains as well. I think there's value in all of them. They're still emerging technologies. Everything is very new. We're still learning how to use them, but for us, when we did a survey of our clients, and the people, the banks and the financial institutions and those that we wanted to be part of this ecosystem, it was just decided that a private permission was what most people felt comfortable with. Hopefully that helps a little and didn't confuse you more.
Thanks, David. So there is also a question by Jacob, and I think Henk very briefly touched upon this, but maybe both David and Henk can take a shot at this. The weak link in traceability or blockchain is the point where the data is produced. How do you ensure that traceability or blockchain data is seen as a trusted source of information despite this weak link? How do you strengthen this weak link?
That's a very good one. So we talk a lot about blockchain and how to safely transfer the data from origin to end markets. But we often, I find, don't talk enough about how do we get good quality data from the ground. And that is really difficult, at least in the context that Rainforest Alliance is active in, and many other people here on the panel. So it's often, like I said earlier, that there's no internet connection, it's remote, there are language difficulties. And we are, as Rainforest Alliance, trying to partly overcome this to do triangulation of data. So we are now with new technologies coming up. So remote sensing is an example of that. We are verifying with other sources, other data sources, the trustworthiness of the information on the ground. And I think that is an example of what we can do, and that should be done.
Great.
And
David?
I'm sure David has more to tell about it.
No. I'm really glad you went first, because that it's a phenomenal question, and I think we could have a whole panel, and I'm sure even the other panelists would have a lot of amazing insights on that. I think the real question is, how do you trust any data, right? I think any data that we have. I mean, if you go to my LinkedIn and you're all welcome to, by the way. I didn't get my email address before, db@sukafina.com, but you can go to LinkedIn and look, and you can look at my profile, and guess what? I put every single piece of information there. Me. I could be lying. I could maybe have never gone to the university, never have had any of these jobs, but I could put it, and is it believable? Ultimately, for me, the value of digitalization, as I mentioned earlier during the panel, is not just to move from analog to digital, but it's the ability for third parties to do validation work of that digital data in a more easily, in an easier format. So if you're on a farm level and you have somebody that comes to the farm and they're able to validate social and environmental work that farmers are doing, our view is that that's a perfect place for that validation to happen, for that organization, for that individual, for that group to be able to do that validation. So the remote sensing that Hank mentioned, perfect example. The satellite imagery that some of the panelists have talked about, another perfect example. So as you go through building these masses of data, the more third-party verification that you have of that data, the more reliable it can be. So I think we don't want to be in a situation where we're just saying, hey, smallholder farmer, just go fill out all these forms and all your information. I don't think that some obviously can do it today, and others it's going to take more time. But if you have third parties that are able to validate data, and we call it issuing digital credentials to farmers that they can store under their identity, but it's validated credentials. Now it's almost as if my university went into LinkedIn and said, we confirm he went to this university. It's as if Sukafina went into my LinkedIn and said, we confirm that's his title and that's how long he's worked here. And it's like the Twitter kind of the blue check, which I don't have because I'm not very popular, but you know, it's that validation that you can trust it more. And for me, that's really the key in digitalization.
Great. Thank you, David. The next question is for Arjun. This is specifically about the scope of AI in crops like rice, maize, cotton, soybean. And of course, this is also open to the other panelists. So Arjun, Rachel asks, what is the scope of AI in crop? I think she specifically is talking about crop value chains like rice, maize, cotton, and soybean.
Sure. So we do this a lot now. You know, Cropin has been in the business for past 10 years, and these are the crops which we do very well. I mean, extremely well. And what we can do right now, since we understand the crop signatures of each and every of those crop, and we are trying to do at the variety level as well right now, with the help of satellites and remote sensing, we understand those crop signatures, and hence we are able to detect what crop is this, what is the current growth stage of each of these crops, and its correlation with rainfalls, yield, soil moisture level. So all of those things we are able to do, not only for the current scenario and the current state at which plot that is, but also historical analysis of what exactly happened in that plot in the past 2 years. And this is extremely useful for number of verticals, from a commodity company, farming organizations, banks. They're able to check agri-worthiness of a particular farmer on a plot level based on those algorithms that we provide. And lately we are seeing a lot of interest from the telecom segment as well, who's able to who wants us to understand, like for example, I would like to find out where soybean is growing in this entire country. So all those kinds of use cases come across to us on a daily basis, and we're able to do that. But yeah, to other panelists as well, if you can add your thoughts, that would be great.
So I would take that. So I think there is also a follow-up question because Gaurav, I think, had mentioned about financial inclusion. So what the follow-up question is, what can AI do for financial inclusion and the BFSI sector as such? Arjun, would you like to take that?
Sure. So the biggest challenge right now for the BFSI is, once they reach out to these farmers to give any kind of loan, they have absolutely no documentation, right? They don't know what work was it doing, what was actually being grown on that particular crop. And this is where AI comes up, and this is where we are able to identify what crop is currently growing and what exactly was happening in the past 2 years. And not only that, but we are also able to give what was the exact yield that has happened in the past 2 years. As a result of all of those information, we are also able to generate agri-worthiness report card system for that particular farmer and the report. Now, this is a big help to any of the BFSI segment who is now able to reach out to maximum number of smallholder farmers, and with just some basic documentation, they're able to at least provide them with the right kind of loan. Now, also the biggest challenge for the BFSI is how do I keep track or monitor these smaller plots? It's just not feasible for my loan officers to visit them on a regular basis. That is where AI comes up, where every week or every month we are able to give them updates on how that progress has been going on in that small plot of land. So this is what helps BFSI segments as well.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Arjun. The next question is on commodity value chains by Vijendra, and again, open to the floor, open to all. How are traceability solutions impacting the business models of intermediaries, especially traders and wholesalers operating in these commodity value chains? David, would you like to take that?
I guess I'm the trader on the panel for a trade house. I mean, listen, it's having a big impact. There's no doubt which direction the world is moving. There's no doubt what our clients are asking us for, and our clients being roasters, in this case, coffee roasters and brands and retailers. And they want more traceability. There's a desire for more transparency. I don't think it's a shock if you look at agriculture trading company financial results over the last 5 or 10 years. They've been oops, sorry, my mic might have cut out for a second. Because I think transparency goes against the grain of traditional commodity trading, right? The way we would traditionally, you would think of us making money is hiding stuff in the dark and nobody knows what's the value of it and trying to extract a yield. But I think moving forward, really, the business model for us is what I mentioned earlier, which is the product plus the data. And our view has been, rather than run away from traceability and run away from transparency, it's almost like we can control our destiny and we need to adapt our business to it. So we often use the example of a yellow taxi cab driver in Uber. Imagine if the yellow taxi cab drivers had invented Uber and had built Uber, rather than pretending there wasn't this friction or this problem with the way the business model existed. So we always say, do we want to be the yellow taxi cab driver, or do we want to be the guys who started Uber? So actually do the exact opposite and actually embrace traceability, embrace transparency, and really view our model as maybe shifting from traders to value addition aggregators. And it's really a bit of a mind shift. And our goal at Sukafina is that we want over half of our sales and our revenue to be what we call value added, where we're really moving away from the transactional side of the business, and it's really just repetitive supply chain management for our partners. So I would say that's the start of an attitude shift that we see, at least within the coffee industry.
Great, thanks, David. I think we'll take two last questions. The next one is by Walter, and maybe Henk, you can answer this one. Are farmers accepting the implementation of traceability systems because they need to meet a particular food safety standard, or just want to implement a traceability system on their farms?
That's a good one as well. So I think that farmers want to be part of an interconnected global supply chain, and I think they join traceability initiatives and are part of that because it connects them to a better end market. To me, it's as simple as that.
Okay, all right. Thanks.
It's an opportunity to be part of a system where information is being shared, and often premium markets, if you look to coffee.
Sure. The last question here for the day is, there are actually two parts to it. How can farmers monetize on the data they would own? And second question is, who should bear the cost of traceability in the supply chain? And again, open to all speakers here. Kevik, would you like to take that first?
Yeah, I think that's essentially the million-dollar question. I think essentially, in my opinion, I don't think the cost has to be literally split equally within the value chain. I think those that who have a greater purchasing power should be the ones absorbing most of the costs. In this case, consumers who purchase tires should be willing to pay a premium for tires that are sustainably manufactured. And of course, moving on, I think tire majors have their part to play as well. So I think it's got to be distributed in a way where farmers have leverage on the data they own, because I think that's valuable data, and that's the data that is passed on through the supply chain further downstream to the end users. So I think the data, again, I mean, taking what the other panelists have said, I mean, it depends on how we collect data and what sort of data is collected for it to be meaningful and impactful. And that will determine the cost that needs to be paid for this traceability within this value chain.
Thanks, Kevik. David, same question to you. How can farmers monetize on the data they would own? Who should bear the cost of traceability in the supply chain? What are your thoughts?
I fully agree with what was just said. I think ultimately we're fooling ourselves. If the consumer doesn't care and doesn't want to pay for traceability, then a lot of our efforts are probably wasted. And that's a horrible thing to say, I know, because we're putting it all on the consumer, but it's really consumers that tend to drive most of the changes. I'm convinced that the digital native millennial, post-millennial does care, and that they're willing to pay a small premium. I'm not saying that they want to go out and pay 3 times as much. And I think there's a discussion around the cost of traceability starting out being very high today, but as we build scale, that cost is going to come down. So I do feel like, in a very simplistic way, if you're somebody who's giving data, you should be more compensated. And if you're somebody who's taking data, you should be more the person who's paying. And obviously the farmer is one of the most principal people who is contributing data to the ecosystem. So in that case, I view it as, again, going back to that idea of, if you have 5 farmers and only one of those farmers is able to provide you with traceability data that can be linked back to show that they are growing their products in a sustainable way, then there should be willing buyers who say, I actually want to source that specific product. I'm willing to pay a premium for that product. But at the same time, the person who's buying that product may want to be able to prove to their consumer that they're a responsible sourcing entity. So they need to have access of that proof, so that if the consumer goes, how do I know that you're actually responsibly sourced? At a click of a button, they can say, this SKU came from these 3 countries, came from these 12 supply chains, came from these 3,000 farmers, and here are the credentials that prove that those farmers are sustainable. So there's a benefit by that brand being able to now prove the claims that they're making about responsible sourcing, and hopefully at the same time, to be able to do that, they're willing to pay a premium, and that premium flows through to the farmer themselves. And so that's why I think not only having the traceability, but also tracking the digital payments and having that digital payment mechanism where you can trace and make sure that the money's getting to the farmer is also one of the keys.
Great, thanks,
So
David.
So if I could just add one thing, right? So and completely agree with what Kavik and David mentioned. There has been a few points on cost, right? So when we look at the cost of again traditional certification and compare that with the cost of traceability, there is again a difference of multiple scales. So the traditional ground-based certification is multiple times more expensive, let's say per farm, compared to traceability. And I'm not saying that we replace traceability with traditional certification, but there, if we need to achieve an ambition where we want to have a system where sustainability is not just a niche product, it becomes mainstream, where the common consumer who is consuming coffee or chocolate is able to buy commodities that is deforestation free, right? So if we need to reach that system and achieve the sustainable production and sustainable value chain at scale, then we need to think of a different system. And in that system, if we compare the cost of traditional certification schemes versus a hybrid system that combines traceability with some level of third-party verification, then those costs in the case of traceability plus hybrid system will be much lower than, let's say, if the same amount of land is verified based on traditional certification scheme. So I think in that way we also need to put that in perspective a bit.
That was a great perspective, Gaurav. Thank you so much. Henk, your final thoughts on the same question. How can farmers monetize on the data that they would own, and who should bear the cost for the traceability?
Yeah, a lot has been said already, so I have, to be honest, not a lot to add. So indeed agree that it's a market-driven approach. So the greater the demand for sustainability and for transparency and information, the bigger the drive and how that can be organized. And indeed, like David said, at scale, so as this grows, this will become much more affordable, and we need to find ways how to implement this across value and supply chains. And it's really hard to say something specific about that, because that really also depends on the specific supply chain. And for farmers to monetize data, yes, great, though it's not that easy. So it requires, I think, also a bit of economies of scale. So farmers, they need to then, if they want to do that, organize around a trader together with a significant actor or a bigger cooperative aligned to have the bargaining power to organize that in the supply chain, and to additionally to a crop, so to coffee or cocoa, to sell in a way information about the origin, about a deforestation-free product, a product that is grown without forced labor, etc. But that will become much more important indeed. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today, and thank you, audience, for joining us. That brings us to the end of the session. We'll see you the next time. Thank you so much. Great day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.